I've been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class and I aced all of my exams. As soon as the last sergeant had shaken my hand at graduation, I had a job offer, and I eagerly agreed to fly across the country just so that I could be seen as a dependable person. Even so, nothing that they could have taught me in training would have prepared me for the horror that can stem from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or black bears don't kill you, then there's still plenty of other things that will. When I first agreed to take the job as an assistant trainee at the state police barracks in Newport, I thought that it would be all pretty green mountains and delicious maple syrup, but boy, was I wrong. I originally hail from Anaheim, California, and I'm convinced that this frigid wasteland will be the death of me. I've always considered myself a tough chick, but I know now that I'm woefully unequipped to handle the things that lurk out there. And the call that started my living nightmare should have been a standard domestic abuse case, but instead, it ruined my entire perception of reality. In the 3.5 years that I've been here for, I've seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks squished to death by fallen trees, cars that were totaled after running into a gigantic moose, and timber rattlesnakes that are as mean as any diamondback. I thought that those were bad enough encounters, but I wasn't prepared to find myself in a situation that I was utterly unprepared for. I had daydreamed about how to get out of tons of different tricky, life-threatening scenarios before, but never had I envisioned myself in one that I straight up couldn't figure out how to handle. I didn't have any paperwork to do last Saturday, and since I'm field trained, I asked my friend Officer T if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse call that had just come in. His partner had already gone home for the night, so he readily agreed to take me along as backup. As we threw on our jackets and headed out to the snow-dusted patrol cruiser, I felt a flutter of excitement, I must admit. I hadn't gone out in the field in a few months, and I'd been itching for some action now that most recent classes had graduated. I looked over the notes, ingraining into my mind that we needed to speak with a Mr. B who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer T and I drove for about 15 minutes, eventually finding ourselves on one of those pothole-covered roads that Vermont is famous for. The snow was up to our thighs, and even our tactical SUV was having some trouble getting up a few of the icier hills. But we cursed our luck at being sent to a residence out in the countryside, especially since it was about 7 p.m. and it was pitch black out. A concerned neighbor had called us, and when we got to Mrs. F's house to hear her report, the distressed woman told us that there were strange screams coming from the creek area behind the houses. We had been under the impression that the fighting had been occurring inside her neighbor's house, and she said that it had until about 10 minutes before our arrival. She led us out to her back porch, and sure enough, after stepping through the doorway, we heard the screams. They were very hard to describe, I must admit, and they sounded like a low-pitched version of a frantic woman yelling. Each scream lasted for about 3 to 10 seconds, though it never sounded like it was actually saying words. It was a cry of just sheer terror stuck on an infinite loop, and my adrenaline was pumping so hard that I didn't even want to bother knocking on Mr. B's door. A normal protocol dictates that we go next door and question the suspect, but under circumstances where someone is clearly in trouble, we're allowed to prioritize the public's safety over standard inquiries. So we sprinted from the front porch, making our way as quickly but carefully as we could towards the sound. Officer T and I heard 2 more screams, which were getting louder as we approached the creek. We were both getting a little unnerved, and as we made our way into the woods, we quietly discussed if it could be an animal. The screams of a mountain lion can sound just like those of a distressed woman at times, and our little flashlights weren't doing much to illuminate the shadow-filled forest. We were finally approaching the creek bed, though, and we hadn't heard a scream for about 5 minutes now. We had begun calling out for somebody to come forward if they were there or to help lead us to them, but there was no more sound. I began checking for footprints, though, and there were only ours and something that looked vaguely deer-like. The powdered snow that we were kicking up was causing a fine sheen of mist-like coverage, but even so, we did a thorough sweep of the area and hadn't seen any signs of blood trail or struggle or anything. Officer T and I were just about to turn back and head for the car when the air around us just erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and savage howling. We were both startled, and I could see my confusion echoed in his face. I opened my mouth to make sure that he was experiencing the same crazy phenomena that I was, and then we heard an exact copy of the scream from where we were on the porch. It came from directly behind us, but there was nothing there but an open clearing. Officer T resolutely marched into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate, and then there was another chunk of silence for several minutes. I didn't even hear footsteps crunch, and I was starting to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he emerged from a different direction, and for a split second, I thought that I saw his eyes shine red in the beam from my flashlight. I dismissed the thought, though, knowing that the glint of the snow off the light was playing tricks on me. Officer T beckoned me over, but I told him that we needed to get out of here. He looked almost angry for a moment. Then he crossed the clearing with me. I watched with unease as he plowed awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he'd been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when an odd cry came from our right, and I nearly screamed out loud at this one. And that was the last straw for me. I grabbed Officer T's arm and all but dragged him back through the snow, keeping a firm grip on his biceps so that he couldn't fall or stumble again. I was 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so strongly that I was able to get through the snow and up the hill like it was nothing. And just as we got halfway up to the house, the scream came again. It was so loud this time that it seemed to be right next to me, so I frantically shone my flashlight around, but there was nothing. In that glacial Vermont forest, there was no glinting of animal eyes, no rustling of bushes, no sound of footfalls, just tense silence. As I frantically traced our steps back to the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air, and it almost sounded like my name. It lasted for about 10 seconds straight, and it was much louder than before. By this time I was terrified, but I kept my wits about me enough to stop and tell Mrs. F to call us if anything else occurred. She never did call again, though, and I got us out of there as fast as the cruiser could go safely. I still don't know what was in those woods, but as an avid outdoors woman, I know no animals make those kinds of wails. One thing in particular, which still gives me shivers too, is how it was just completely silent between the screams. That may not seem that odd to you guys, but during the harsh winters in Vermont, there's still always some type of ambient sound when you're out in the forest. Even if it's just the lonesome cries of a crow or the wind causing bare branches to rub together, there's always something. That night, though, even back by Mrs. F's house, away from the source of the wailing, there was just absolutely no sound. And whenever I bring this up, Officer T just says the same cryptic sentence, and he tells me that I should be glad that I got out of there alive because the danger was closer than I knew. So about 8 months back, I was getting a hefty amount of sleep paralysis, and I've had quite a few troubling and strange encounters that I'd like to share here. I hope you guys enjoy this. So the first one that I can recall was way back in the 7th grade. I was around 13 at the time, I'd say, and going through a very toxic part of my life. I remember going to bed one night and seeing a strange figure standing next to my TV at the foot of the bed. It was tall, probably around 5'11", and surrounded by a black mist. Whatever this thing was had shown up multiple times in my peripheral vision as a kid as well. It didn't feel too dangerous, it felt more like possibly a friend even. And for some reason, a small voice in my head always referred to it as Noah, and so I call it that nowadays. The second one was a strange combination between the Rake and SCP-096 with big butter-coloured bug eyes. It ranged to around 6'5", it usually having to hunch over to not bump its head on the ceiling. Really, really skinny, with pale yellowish skin and extremely bony. Its arms had very long clawed fingers and its nails usually dragged on the floor. No mouth was ever seen either. I've only ever seen stretch marks where one would be. and this weird fellow always seemed to just show up whenever it was really, really late, and the message was, "You need to go to bed and go to sleep," would drone in my head whenever I saw it in my room. Not harmful either, just really terrifying and usually scared me to sleep. For the greater good, I suppose. I ended up naming him Butter Eyes for his very notable face. But the last one is nowhere near as nice as the other two. I've done my fair slice of reading around and haven't found any information about this thing, but I have a feeling that there's got to be information somewhere. So it was a night at the final stretch of my 8th grade school year. I headed to sleep and was out for a good few hours, I'd say, before the paralysis kicked in sometime around 2 or 3 a.m. What I remember is feeling choked and cold and just being dragged up to sit up on my bed. And there was a black goat with a dapper dark grey suit with a red jewel at the tie length walking out of my closet and flicking his hand. He flung me out of my bed and onto the floor in the middle of the room. He walked over to me and stared at me with his crimson-coloured eyes. I floated up to his waist at this point, him standing around 6 foot tall in a concrete platform with the usual ritual candles appear below me. He took his black-gloved hand and shoved it into my gut, just below my belly button. I do remember thrashing around as my arms and legs were stretched out and unable to move. His right forearm disconnected, leaving a wispy ghost-like one in his place, and he pulled his arm back out. He'd left a part of him in me, and the platform disappeared. I was dropped onto the floor with a thud. He looked back at me as he walked into my closet and flicked his left hand, putting me back into my bed under the covers. I woke up the next morning shaking and teary, and with the feeling of just like a lead ball in my gut for almost a week. I drew a cross on my stomach and kept it there until the feeling went away. The paranoia of whatever that was still coming back every so often, but with time the feeling faded. I know that all of this is just sleep paralysis and it's all on my head, but I still feel a heaviness in my gut today, like whatever that thing was, maybe it wasn't all just in my head. So I live in Mexico City. I'm 21 years old, and through all my life, I've always witnessed paranormal situations around me. Things like voices in the middle of the night, doors opening and closing, the feeling of someone sitting on my bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, my bed sheets being pulled away at night, and TV turning on for no reason, and just so much more. At first, I was frightened, of course. My kid years were just plagued with horrible nights and the feeling of something watching me from the dark corners of my room. Later in my life, though, I just got used to it, up to the point where if anything happened, I just said shut up or let me be. My first strong paranormal experience, though, was when I was 15. During that time, I was a dancer with my ex-girlfriend. During the months that we practiced the dance, I started to become more angry, violent, and didn't want to talk to anyone. I used to be a kid with a great attitude, so it was a surprise for everyone who knew me that I was behaving this way. The nights were especially horrible. More than once I had sleep paralysis where I couldn't even blink and was dying out of horror as in the corner of my room I felt something look at me. Each time I had sleep paralysis too, I felt that shadow was just getting closer and closer. I started to have bad grades and my attitude was getting worse up to a point where I actually started a fight out of nowhere once when I hit a guy with just one punch. So hard in the chest, in fact, that he just fell down and couldn't stand up. But one night I was having sleep paralysis and felt that shadow was closer. I somehow, with all of my strength and fear, was able to stand up and stare with confusion to the darkness. Then, behind me, I felt something touch my neck, and I swear to God that I heard something saying, in a soft voice like a whisper, "Mine." Needless to say, I was shocked. To be honest with you guys, I didn't even believe what happened, and I just sat down on the floor shocked till my alarm sounded for school. I dressed and went to school, but my mother said that when she saw me that my face was pale and had no expression. But the next day, she asked me what was going on with me, and I told her everything that's happened to me in the past weeks. She knew that I'd had paranormal experiences when I told her, but she always said that it was just in my mind and that those things weren't real. But this time, she saw me in so much horror and actually related those experiences to my sudden change of behavior to the paranormal. And that was when my aunt came in. She has been for quite some years a practitioner of Centeria. I don't really know how to say that in English, sorry about that. But basically it's a religion in Mexico and in many more Spanish-speaking countries. To summarize it, they believe that there are good spirits and bad spirits, and the bad spirits feed on the light of people until they take everything, destroying the person in many ways, psychologically, emotionally, and even physically. They apparently talk with good spirits, which help people in their need, and these spirits do not feed on light but on fire, essence of food, blood of animals, which, based on their beliefs, are bad people who reincarnated in these animals and through sacrifice they cleanse their soul. I was taken to one of these, and the first thing that he said was that he felt the darkness and anger of a spirit which had impregnated me, and that it was the reason for my sudden change in character and constant night paralysis. My uncle, as he wanted me to call him, performed a ritual on me after this, and my uncle alongside other Santeros were around me and started the ritual with some chants that sounded kind of pagan-y. They burned mesquite and other things to create a dense smoke, light fires around me, and for the final touch, a black chicken was sacrificed, and they poured its blood all over me, alongside more cleaning with plants and smoke and other stuff. But the weirdest thing about this was that while they chant, I heard more voices. There were around 6 people, but I swear that I heard a lot more of people chanting around me. At the end of the ritual, too, I felt different, as if I was lighter, more relaxed. I was given a token after this. It was covered in the blood of the chicken, and my uncle said to me that a spirit was now bound to me and that he or she will protect me. I asked him about the voices, which he replied that these were the voices of the spirit that protect him and the rest of the 6. They chant alongside so that they could clean my soul and to help me bound to my protector spirit. On the way back home, we apparently have to get rid of the chicken body. The spirits told Uncle that it had to be on a graveyard, so we parked beside one and I threw it over the fence. So once I got home, it was plain dark and I walked up to my room. My house is an old house where my room is on the 3rd floor, kind of like an attic, and I was nervous because I thought after the ritual that the entity would try to harm me. But I opened the door and some kind of small cloud of smoke crossed the door and just disappeared. I'm not sure about this, but when that cloud of smoke was leaving, I thought I saw the resemblance of a face or something. Either way, if I saw a face or not, though, it was not possible for smoke to be in my room. I mean, the windows were closed and there was nothing that could have created it. In the end, I just assumed it was dust that flew out, but that night was the very first night of plain rest that I'd had in weeks, and for that, I was grateful.